October 4th, 1957 was when the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, was aboard a ballistic missile. The United States ignored the announcement of Sputnik. Eisenhower said that Sputnik was a useless hunk of metal. Some Americans believed that the Russians could drop bombs from satellites. Sputnik traveled 900 kilometers above the Earth's surface. It took 1 hour and 35 minutes to complete a full orbit around the Earth. Sputnik had a spherical shape and weighed 83.6 kilograms. It had 2 radio transmitters that were transmitting signals to stations all over the USSR, where scientists observed the satellite and determined elements of trajectory. On November 3, 1957, Sputnik 2 was launched at 11:03 with the dog Laika aboard. The cabin was equipped with sensors to measure ambient pressure and temperature, as well as the dog's blood pressure, breath frequency, and heartbeat. The food system for Laika was made out of an ammunition belt from a machine gun. It carried small trays of jelly-like high-calorie food through a tube. Laika could stand up, sit down, lay down, and slightly move back and forth inside its cabin. Sadly, Laika didn't survive. By the 4th orbit, none of the physiological sensors were returning data, evidence that Laika was dead. Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. His spacecraft, called Vostok 1, was launched on April 12, 1961. Vostok 1 reached speeds of 27,400 kilometers per hour. He was in an orbital flight for 108 hours. His re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere was computer-controlled, and he ejected from the Vostok 1 and landed by parachute. Sadly, Gagarin was killed in a plane crash before he could travel in space for a second time. A crater on the far side of the moon was named after him. Valentina V. Tereshkova was the first woman in space. She was an expert in parachuting and textile worker and a member of the Young Communist League. She volunteered and was chosen from 4 other applicants. She was trained by Andriy Nikolaev, whom she later married. On June 16, 1963, she boarded Vostok 5. She orbited the Earth 48 times and was in space for 70.8 hours. Her radio name was Chiaba, which means seagull in Russian. When she re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, she parachuted out of Vostok 5 and landed 380 miles northeast of Karaganda, Kazakhstan. Vostok 5 was recovered on June 19th. She was honored with the United Nations Gold Medal of Peace.
American astronauts Edward White, Virgil Grimson, and Roger Chaffee were killed in a fire. On Friday, January 27, 1967, at 1 p.m., the 3 astronauts entered the capsule on Pad 34 to begin the test. The first problem was the sour smell of the spacesuits. They took samples and continued their testing. The second problem was the high oxygen flow. It resulted from movement of the crew in the spacecraft. The third problem was the failure of communication, which forced a hold of the countdown at 5:40 p.m. By 6:31, everyone was ready for the countdown. Then ground instruments showed unexplained rise in oxygen. 4 seconds later, they heard Chaffee say, "I smell fire." And what followed was White saying, "Fire in the cockpit!" The fire spread throughout the cockpit in a matter of seconds. The interior pressure held the hatchet closed. Technicians tried to open the hatchet repeatedly, but were driven away because of the smoke and the heat. Then the command module ruptured. They were able to open the hatchet 5 minutes after the fire started. The astronauts' remains were found at the time. The fire started from a short circuit in a bundle of wires that ran to the left and just in front of Grimson's seat. After this tragedy, they built all of their other spacecrafts with an outward opening, quickly operating hatchets, and put self-extinguishing components, and used a nitrogen-oxygen mixture at launch. The astronauts died from carbon monoxide asphyxia with thermal burns as a contributing cause.
The Russians also had a tragedy that wasn't long after the Americans' tragedy. On April 24, 1967, Soyuz 1 was launched with Vladimir Komarov as the pilot. When the spacecraft re-entered Earth's atmosphere, the drag chute developed, but the main parachute did not. When Komarov developed the reserve parachute, it got tangled with the drag chute. The Soyuz 1 crashed on April 24, 1967 at 7 a.m. with the pilot still inside. Komarov's ashes were buried in the Kremlin wall in a massive ceremony.
On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. The Columbia, with Mike Collins in it, and the Eagle, with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in it, separated perfectly. Neil Armstrong reported back to Houston that the Eagle has wings. Slowly, the Eagle began its trip to the Sea of Tranquility. 12 minutes later, the Eagle touched down. "The Eagle has landed," reported Armstrong. Armstrong and Aldrin had their first meal on the moon, and then helped each other put on the bulky spacesuits. The suits were so stiff that they couldn't see what they were doing.
When Armstrong pocketed the first moon rock, Aldrin had to direct his hands. Armstrong tested spacecraft ladders, and when he stepped on the moon, he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Aldrin joined Armstrong, and they set up a tripod and mounted the rigid United States flag. They tried various ways of moving on the moon: walking, loping, and jumping. Then they got a call from Nixon. They saluted him and all the other Earthlings and continued their work. They set up experiments and collected samples.
Before they left, they deposited their sewage from the Eagle on the moon and went back home, where they had to stay in quarantine for 18 days. Nobody could be absolutely sure at the time that there was no life on the moon that might contaminate us on Earth. They spent 21 hours on the moon.